I always believed that I was destined to solve some of the world's greatest mysteries, only to discover that it was me who needed solving. I learned this last summer when I made the bold decision to travel by myself across country. I was 3 years out from my military retirement and really struggling to discover my purpose. And nothing I did seemed to satisfy me, not my return to school, not finding another job, and certainly not sitting around idle all day watching television. So at the end of June, with my wife's blessing, I packed up my truck with everything I thought I would need for a 3-week camping trip. I packed clothes, a tent, a sleeping bag, and trust me, enough beef jerky to feed a small army. And I thought I was ready to go. However, on the morning that I was scheduled to depart, I found it very difficult to leave my driveway. Despite all this excitement I was feeling, I was more terrified than anything. Not because I'd be driving more than 2,600 miles, but because it would mark the first time I would ever embark on an adventure just for me. And at the time, I had no idea just what an adventure it could be, because you see, until that point, I had constrained myself to living life within the boundaries of other people's stories. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I was a military member. I was a husband. I was my father's son. And each of these came with a very discrete story which told me what to think, how to behave, and what to believe. And I never once thought that by adopting these stories, I would lose myself. But that's exactly what happened. So as I sat behind the steering wheel that morning, I knew that if I pulled out of my driveway, I would be dismantling everything I thought I believed. I'd be creating my own story, forging my own path, and that scared the heck out of me. And to be honest, if not for this little voice inside my head urging me forward, I don't think I ever would have put my truck into drive and stepped on that gas pedal. You see, it was the voice of my 7-year-old self. And he really wanted this journey, and I knew exactly why. You see, both my parents were avid readers, and I would often find myself with them at used bookstores. Now, one day when I was 5 or 6 years old, I happened to be rummaging through these cardboard boxes filled with old magazines. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, right? I was just enjoying the magazine covers as a way to spend the time as they shopped. And as I thumbed through old issues of Time, National Geographic, and Popular Mechanics, something caught my eye. Unlike the other magazine covers, which featured pictures of things that I recognized, right, like the Great Pyramids of Giza or the polar bears of the North Pole, the February 1968 issue of Argosy was very different. Because you see, on the right-hand edge were printed a series of 5 photographic stills. Now, these stills had been extracted from a 53-second film shot just 4 months earlier in the Pacific Northwest by Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin. And these were nothing like I'd ever seen before. These two had somehow captured pictures of this unknown animal that was large, bipedal, and completely covered in brownish black fur. To put it mildly, those pictures of Bigfoot I saw that day sparked this desire to explore and experience in person our mysterious world. The problem was I never pursued that, because even by the time I was 7, I had already subscribed to other people's stories. You see, my parents in the media, they told me that exploring was too dangerous and too risky, right? That I would be injured, killed, or worse yet, consumed by cannibals. School told me that only smart people could make discoveries, right? That I would only discover something if I were to spend a lifetime learning about whatever it is that I wanted to discover. And as proof, they would cite the likes of Charles Darwin or Ernest Shackleton, right? Experts in their respective fields, because they had this extensive education. Life in the meantime was teaching me that to have the sort of experiences I wanted, I'd need to earn a lot of money and somehow find the time, neither of which felt they were available to me. Now, these were lies, of course, but the fact is, once I decided to believe these stories, they became part of my identity. So here I was, 50 years later, about ready to change all that, right? In the spring, I made reservations in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona, because legend said in the 1870s, a German prospector by the name of Jacob Waltz, known as the Dutchman, had found a Spanish gold mine and who had kept it secret, giving the details away only upon his deathbed. So me and my 7-year-old, we were going to find the lost Dutchman mine and solve a great mystery. Now, I was thinking about that story as I pulled my truck over to the shoulder right outside of the White Sands Missile Range in southern New Mexico. I had finally left Massachusetts 3 days earlier, knowing full well I was still relying on my old stories to get me this far. And I knew it because I hadn't yet felt any fear. 35 years of Coast Guard military training taught me that plans were necessary because without them, I would fail. So I carefully planned every stage of my trip. I knew how far I'd be driving each day. I knew when I'd be stopping for breaks, and I knew where I'd be sleeping each night. And although technically I was on a camping trip, I hadn't done any. Instead, I was playing it safe by staying in hotels. And to be honest, I did an amazing job. I had crossed 9 states without incident. I was well rested, and I always had the right level of gas in my truck. But let me tell you, it was boring because all I saw were highways and hotels, and that was not what I was seeking. So it really was time for me to challenge my first story. Now, I'd heard the term dispersed camping, having come across it a few times when planning for my trip. And in essence, dispersed or primitive camping refers to camping in areas that are not controlled or maintained. And I knew that New Mexico offered it because earlier that morning I had passed by countless tents and trailers sprawled across the desert floor. The question was, could I do it? Did I have the mettle to pitch a tent in the middle of nowhere and survive the night? Well, something inside me said, do it. So despite how scary that felt, I pulled out my phone, found a camping location right outside of White Sands National Park, and proceeded to cancel my hotel reservation. And let me tell you, for someone like me, that was huge because I sincerely believed that if I defied the plan without any idea of the outcome, I wouldn't survive the night. I could not have been more wrong. After setting up my tent, grabbing a quick snack, I sat on a blanket to watch the sunset over Holloman Lake. And as I enjoyed the spectacle of it all, I reflected on how I was feeling. Gone was the fear. It was replaced by a new feeling, one of empowerment, and rightfully so, because for the first time, I had pushed through this old story to change my mind. By doing something different, something unexpected, I learned that I didn't always need to be organized. I didn't always need a plan, and I didn't always need to know the outcome. All I really needed was a little courage and the wherewithal to listen to my intuition, and that felt authentically me. Now, did this first dispersed camping trip go according to my expectations? Well, of course not, right? Not long after I set up my tent, a group of rowdy drinkers showed up to keep me awake till well past midnight. Still, when I woke up that next morning to the singing birds and the sun gleaming off that white gypsum, I was a different version of me. I mean, it was subtle for sure, but I could feel a definite shift. I knew White Sands had changed my belief system at a very fundamental level. Now, I got back on the road, drove a few more hours, and I happened to stop at a McDonald's in Lordsburg, New Mexico. And when I was getting my coffee, I happened to notice this small sign right near the side of the road that simply read, Gila Cliff Dwellings, with an arrow pointing north. Now, I had no idea what that was, but I had this new thought. Why not have another adventure? Now, the fact that I even had this thought was pretty amazing because for me, it was demonstrating that I was already gaining the confidence I needed to be authentically me. I wanted to do something, so I decided I would, and it felt amazing. But the real lesson for me that day wasn't so much the spontaneity of taking the side trip, but rather what I experienced once I got there. You see, these cliff dwellings, they were so far into the New Mexico wilderness that I lost all connectivity. Like I had no phone service, no internet, no text message capability. But I had gone too far to turn back. The sun was already well past noon, and that sparked this new fear. How was I going to get a hold of my wife? What if she needed something from me? How was she going to survive without me? Now, as irrational as that may sound, as a husband, I sincerely believed that I had certain requirements, certain obligations that could only be met if I were available all the time. It was, of course, another lie that I had created based on watching my parents interact and ongoing codependency issues from 2 prior marriages. The truth is, I sincerely believed that other people could not function without me, that I had to give up my independence in order to rescue them from problems that were very rarely my own. And my wife saw this in me too, and it encouraged me to take this trip. Now, had she not been so supportive, I probably would have gone anyway because I felt that strongly about changing me. But at Gila, I really would be put to the test because I had no choice but to be self-reliant, to be me. Now, I was pleasantly surprised to find that they too offered primitive camping. Now that I was an expert, I went ahead and set up a tent in the woods, and then spent the rest of the day exploring the cliff dwelling, taking some walks, and seeing some incredible wildlife. You know, being alone and completely disconnected, I felt something new shift inside me. By removing those outside influences and releasing those assumptions and expectations, I recalled the feeling of childhood. You know, the joy I felt building houses and forts in the trees along the shores of Lake Erie and exploring the thick woods behind my home. And for the first time in nearly 5 decades, I reconnected with nature and remembered just how much nature meant to me. More importantly, I remembered that I was once independent and I could be again. Now, when I talked to my spouse that following day, guess what? She was just fine. It seems we both survived a day of independence. But for me, it proved it was possible. It was yet another story that I felt empowered to change. I made it to the Superstitions the following day and spent the next 4 exploring the area. But it was the 5th and final day that would have the most meaning to me. Now, earlier that morning, I had hiked deep into the mountains to see this beautiful set of petroglyphs that had been carved in the rocks along this old creek bed. And I'll admit it was a pretty exhausting hike because I had to scramble over boulders and push through cactuses and thorn bushes that really didn't like me very much. Unfortunately, I had not found the lost Dutchman's gold. But I was more than happy with those petroglyphs. And to be honest, it didn't really matter whether I found any gold or not, right? What really mattered to me was that I was doing something I always wanted to do, not something someone else expected me to do. You see, through no fault of his own, my father had taught me that hard work was the key to survival, and that personal sacrifice was the means to that end. It's why I tended to measure my self-worth by my accomplishments, right? The things I did for other people. And it also explained why I, like him, never took vacations, never spent any money, but never felt our personal lives were as important as our profession. So the Superstitions stood in direct contrast then to the stories that I had. And from that point forward, I was able to recreate or make my own stories moving forward. Now, I was reminded of how powerful those thoughts were later that same day when something unexplained happened. Thinking I was done hiking for the day, I went ahead and took a leisurely drive into Apache Junction for a set of nail clippers. Now, trust me when I say no matter how well you plan for any trip, right, there's always something you forget. But with the sun now setting over Phoenix and back at my campsite, something told me to take another hike. Now, by now, this was kind of a crazy idea because the temperature was well over 95 degrees, so it really wasn't the best time to take a walk. But I decided to do it because I was learning to listen to my intuition. So I put my hiking boots back on and headed out across the desert floor. And with the exception of the wind and the dirt crunching beneath my feet, it was just me and nature. I had let go of all intrusive thoughts and worries, and for me, it was the true definition of peace. My stomach, on the other hand, had a completely different story. I was hungry, so after only a few miles, I decided to turn back. And that's when I saw him. I had rounded this bend, thinking of nothing, listening to my feet, when I passed this row of cactuses to my left, and I just happened to look up towards this small hill or crest to my right. And there, for the briefest of moments, I saw as clear as day a Native American sitting upon a jet black horse. And this was a striking figure because he had this long black hair with these red and yellow feathers hanging down the side of his face. Now, this vision, or whatever you want to call it, was so intense that, no joke, I stopped dead in my tracks because, you see, he was looking directly at me. But here's the thing. I didn't feel threatened or afraid, but rather connected. I felt as if he were a reflection of who I was becoming, a person who didn't need an orchestrated life, didn't need dependence upon others, and didn't need his father's approval. His presence was reminding me that I had the permission to be independent, authentic, and truly me. He and I were people who made our own stories and created our own destinies. You know, with his presence, I had finally solved a great mystery. After years of feeling bound to other people's stories, all I needed was my own, which makes me wonder, whose stories are you living? Thank you.